Here's this week's Steam Code Raffle winner. I give a Steam code for a free game away with every video I do, and all you have to do to enter is leave a comment that wouldn't violate Twitter's terms of service. Make sure you have contact info in your YouTube profile so I can reach out to you. A complete list of games to choose from is in the description below. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss a chance to win. Now on with the show. I'm playing something almost every week, and sometimes I want to talk about it and give you a vertical slice. So stick with me for some lightning reviews. This week on the chopping block. Before I get into the meat of this review, or if I sound a little bit different, or my tone is a little bit less energetic, I've been sick. Nothing serious, but it does affect how I'm able to talk. That being said, this week I've been playing Pokemon Violet. Now, I need to confess something to everyone. I agonized for a bit over whether or not I was even going to review this game. One of my first chopping block videos was Pokemon Sword and Shield, and I ended up sinking about 1,000 hours between the two titles. Most of that was split between breeding for shiny Pokemon or participating in raids, but nonetheless, the base package facilitated me willing to do that. However, my stances and attitudes for Nintendo have heavily shifted since then. Without going into fine detail, I've decided that under most circumstances, I'm not going to cover first-party Nintendo titles, because I don't want to make the mistake of praising a company that I feel is making blatantly anti-consumer choices. But let's not forget, Pokemon is not just a Nintendo property. It's shared between Nintendo and Game Freak, so with that in mind, consider any praise I may deliver directed towards the developers at Game Freak. So, how does it fare? Well, before I get to that, let me state that my expectations were already fairly high because of Pokemon Arceus Legends. By the way, I don't care if you're going to correct me on the pronunciation of Arceus. I pronounce it that way, and you can f*** off. I didn't review it at its release because, well, Nintendo and all that, but there were more than enough voices singing its praises at the time. It was genuinely good, shifting gears to seamless world exploration and emphasizing a focus on capturing and cataloging. It featured moderate stealth mechanics, a genuine danger to the player given that Pokemon could attack you outside of battle, and it no longer had the disjointed separation between battles and the overworld, that even up until Sword and Shield caused an encounter to transport you to some other dimension that was loosely resembling whatever area you had been exploring prior. In fact, the capture mechanics were so polished and emphasized that I began to view entering combat for wild Pokemon as more of a punishment. Being able to stealth up to a random wild monster and throw a ball into the back of its head completely unaware was a far more preferable interaction for me. Quite frankly, the only way I would have been perfectly happy is if Violet and Scarlet brought all of that with the newest generation. Spoiler alert, it didn't. What it did bring over was the ability to explore a seamless world and no longer teleporting you to that alternate dimension I alluded to. Unfortunately, the enhanced capture mechanics and ability to catch monsters outside of battle has been completely removed. It kept a couple traces of those elements by allowing you to still stealth through tall grass, and you can effectively get a free turn on an opponent if you can smack them with the ball while they are unaware. But when I discovered that they were reverting to the traditional capture system, to say I was monstrously pissed was an understatement. Speaking of being monstrously pissed, Nintendo needs to wake up and realize that about half of their audience are longtime fans that have experienced a couple Pokemon games by now, and they don't have to have their hands held with the first hours weighed down with tutorials. This could come down to asking 2 or 3 additional questions in the introduction. Have you played any previous Pokemon games? How familiar are you with Pokemon? Streamlining the introductory process for longtime fans would be very much appreciated and could result with a few menu option presets, or in the very least plopping you in front of the professor to pick your first Pokemon immediately after character creation and have that be where you start. I cannot emphasize how much the start of this game got my blood boiling. Everything mentioned so far was already kindling the fire I wanted to ignite here, but then I started to experience some of the technical shortcomings. There's not necessarily much that is game-breaking, but visual glitches, choppy frame rates, animation f***ups, and ad hoc character model quality fluctuations give the impression of a game that is terribly unpolished in its presentation. I did also have at least one hard crash to the Switch home menu during my playthrough. It's likely that Nintendo is going to patch this down the line, but if they keep going at this rate, then their built-up goodwill may start to drain. Given all the complaints I've had so far, one might think that I've given up on this game and I'm not going to touch it much anymore. Well, at the time of writing, that is not the case. Probably the most meaningful shift that Pokemon has made that one could argue is a step forward for this iteration is fully embracing an open world. Pokemon games have been linear to semi-linear since their formation, so it's interesting to see their take where they go full open world, remove the elements of linearity, and embrace exploration like they partially did in Arceus Legends. I recall an early press release for Scarlet and Violet a way back stating that the world would scale to a degree with the player, and that gyms could be tackled in any order. I don't really view this as a positive or a negative, and here's why. To be somewhat concise, there are primarily 2 different kinds of story in-game. One where you participate in the story, and one where you are or make the story. Ones where you participate in the story are usually your more structured and linear experiences with a solidly written beginning, middle, and end, usually with character arcs and a few other elements. This entry of Pokemon seems to be tailoring more for the latter. It's the same kind of mentality that makes me immediately think of Skyrim, where it fosters your exploration and interaction with the world, and, while there are some story beats that will overlap from player to player, the order can be entirely unique on how you tackle things, or you can even ignore the story and just f*** around as much as you want. And speaking of things that you want, I'm unironically loving the fact that the game no longer forces me into battles while I'm exploring the open world. Now, if you want to battle random trainers, you actually have to go over and talk with them rather than just make eye contact with them, and they trap you for the next few minutes. Outside of capturing Pokemon and participating in gym battles, at the time of initial script writing, I have participated in fewer random Pokemon battles than I have fingers on one hand, and almost all of my experience used for leveling up has been through capturing. Although, speaking of gym leaders, Larry is my new spirit animal, and the hyperactive influencer who fights with electric types, who I beat barely having to think, can go get run over by a bus. Nintendo and Game Freak have seemingly abandoned the traditional narrative structure in support of player freedom, so they can experience it at their pace and play the way that satisfies them the most. Unfortunately, the trade-off when someone moves to the open-world structure is the fact that they have to sacrifice narrative control. Pokemon stories have never been terribly spectacular, with the highlight I'd argue being Pokemon White and Black, with it actually tackling moral questions about whether Pokemon enjoy battling, and whether or not it's good for them, or whether or not we're facilitating an alternate dimension version of dogfighting. I won't go into spoilers, but to summarize, the game gives you effectively 3 separate stories. The story where you battle the gym leaders and become the league champion, the story where you fight the assorted antagonist group that has to be present in every Pokemon game, and the third story pertaining to researching mysterious herbs with medicinal properties that result in boss fights. The third story was probably the one that I got the most invested in, which was good because it also resulted in the legendary dragon on the box art, which you're given at the very start of the game, by the way, to gain mobility options. Although I can clearly tell that I went out of the way of the game's intended order, because on some of the boss fights, I was vastly overleveled and ended up one-shotting them. To reiterate, I was mostly able to go whichever way I wanted, with the biggest risk occasionally being an encounter of a wild Pokemon that was slightly beyond my level capabilities, but a couple minutes of grinding would usually resolve that. Finally, I'm just going to devote a quick word to the battle gimmick where you cause your Pokemon to crystallize and gain extra attack power in its chosen elements, which can sometimes be something other than what it naturally features. It makes battles a little bit more interesting in that there's a significant trade-off about choosing which Pokemon and only one element that you can boost at any given time, but I think the visual design is atrocious. Not the Pokemon being crystallized itself, but the headgear to signify what element they are now going to have boosted attacks for. A petty quibble, but a quibble nonetheless. Actually, speaking of petty quibbles, that's also why I chose Violet over Scarlet. If they were going to give the red dragon wheels, then just give it wheels, not these stupid flesh protrusions that might make sense on a real lizard for mating or something to that effect, but in trying to make it look like a motorcycle, I think it makes about as much sense as trickle-down economics. Pokemon, as a franchise, seems to be making some significant changes, and while they don't feature all the ones that I would have liked to see, and in implementing the ones that it's doing effectively, they fumbled the ball in several other categories, there is the possibility that I will be sinking a couple hundred hours into this one as well. At this point, my biggest grievances are with the intro to the game and the lack of technical polish. If my attitudes shift at all, then I may have to do a supplementary review, or heck, I may do another 1 year later video. Honestly, if you haven't already bought this, then I would say wait until a few patches come out, and, not or, and until a price drop or sale takes effect. And given how stingy Nintendo tends to be with their top-tier intellectual properties going on sale or price reductions, I'd say you'll be waiting a while. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have to determine whether or not I have the physical and mental fortitude in order to facilitate a holiday video project I'm contemplating. Hey, look at that, it's the end of the video. Don't forget to subscribe, and remember that commenting can actually win you a free prize. So until next time, this is Gheeotine saying thanks for watching and keep your head on your shoulders.